Today, what I want to talk about is the health and wealth of nations, and to explore Gapminder so that we can look at a certain section of geography or studies in geography which deal with demographics and how nations develop. So again, the title of this video lecture is The Health and the Wealth of Nations. And I want you to think a little bit about how we compare one nation to another. And let's think a little bit about how this has changed over time. So if you talk to a lot of folks, they kind of lump countries into two categories, and they'll refer to a country as a first world nation, which implies that that is the best or a better nation. But then on the other side, they will refer to some countries as being third world nations, which has kind of a negative connotation that they're not as good as another place. And so it's generally accepted that first world and third world nations are not politically correct terms. And a more appropriate term is to talk about countries as being maybe developed or in a stage where they are developing. But again, maybe not the most politically correct terms. If we say, oh, we're highly developed and you're not, then, maybe that upsets people and again gives a negative perception about a place. And what we're going to find today, or I hope that you come to the conclusion of, is that two categories that try to rate nations is no longer relevant, and that the world is kind of flattening off in a lot of areas that relate to demographics. And so maybe one way we assess the level of development of a nation is in how long you live, or life expectancy, or the average lifespan that one might expect to live. Whereas another metric might be to simply measure the wealth of a particular nation. And so, conceptually, when I talk to students, they kind of talk about we versus them, where we responds to the Western world, and them is everybody else. And again, maybe not appropriate, but seems to be something that students often gravitate to. So what does we and them really mean, especially in terms of life expectancy and dollar bills, and maybe how many children or how fast a population might grow? So we can see that the Western world typically has people that live to be old, in old age, right? Of course, it varies, and life expectancy is going up. But we also kind of think that Western developed nations or first world nations have lots of money. And this often means that they have few children because they want to do other things, have fun, don't need lots of kids around. Whereas the rest of the world, or developing nations, has very little money. They often die young, and they have lots of children, right? And you say, hey, why would they have lots of children? They don't have any money. They're not going to live very long. Why would they want to have lots of kids? Well, they need children to do things like agricultural work or something like that. So they don't have money to buy lots of machinery, but they have the ability to have kids and do work. So it makes perfect sense. So we have we, which is old, small families, lots of money. And we have them, which is lots of children, dying young, and poor. Is this an accurate depiction of the world today? I want you to really be thinking about this. And now we're going to transition to a software program called Gapminder, which will present the statistics in a very neat graphical way. So bear with me while I change screens. Okay, so here we can see a software application called Gapminder, which pulls together tons of demographic data from across the world and puts it in a nice platform where we can graph these things out. And so what we have here on the y-axis is life expectancy, and over here on the x-axis we have income per person, or GDP per capita. And what we want to look at is if money, or the amount of money you make, has any sort of relationship or correlation to life expectancy. The assumption being that the more money you make, the longer that you will live. So here we can see in 1800 that there is a cluster where all the countries basically fit together. And we can see people don't make very much money and they don't live to be very old, right? But we can look at how this changes over time by going over here and hitting the play button. And we can see what happens over basically the next 213 years since the data stops at 2013. So I hit the play button, and we can see that these bubbles start jumping up and down. So if it goes up on the y-axis, it means these countries are living longer. The bubbles are color-coded based on region in the world. So orange is Asia, yellow is the Americas, blue is part of Africa, red is Southeast Asia and Australia and Indonesia. But we can see there are major changes going on in the world, and some countries are progressing, right, in making more money and living longer, while others are stuck down in the low life expectancy and low dollar bill signs, and some jump around all over the place. So it looks like there are several kind of different factors at play here that are affecting ultimately life expectancy of a country. But if we look at the overall change or pattern, we can see that many of these countries moved out of this low life expectancy zone, making very little money, progressing up into a world that is kind of flattened off, right? So we don't see these major differences between countries that we saw maybe back in the 1940s and 1950s. And what's really neat is that we can turn on trails, and I can rewind this play clock, and we can actually pick certain countries that we want to compare. So I'm, for the sake of this argument, going to compare China, the United States, and also Kuwait. So here we can see this is China, and the size of the bubble is proportionate to the number of people that live in that country. So China has a huge population. That's why the bubble is bigger than, say, the United States. And then over here we can see Kuwait. So there are some differences. Kuwait, even though we think of that as being a third world nation or developing, obviously them, actually has a longer life expectancy and makes more money than a person in the United States. And then China isn't too far behind in life expectancy, but they are clearly not making as much money as people in North America. So what we're going to do is we're going to go down this list over here, and I'm going to select China, and then I'm going to select Kuwait, and lastly United States. And you can see that those are all highlighted and labeled on the map, so we can more clearly see what is going on with those particular countries. And I'm going to turn on trails so we can see how these nations have changed in their life expectancy and income over time. So I'll go here, and again we see that Kuwait is really starting out at the bottom here. So they had lower life expectancies and made about as much money as China, but the US is clearly out in the lead. And so we'll go ahead and hit play and see what happens over time. So there's not much of a change until we get to about the 1910s. We'll just watch here. So China has taken a little bit of a dip, and all of a sudden 1890s looks like life expectancy is increasing. 1910, we're starting to make more money. 1913, get to 1920. Oh, all of a sudden there was a dip. Wonder why there was a dip. Turns out the Spanish influenza happened. But again, the U.S. has taken off as a clear leader, right? And everyone else is staying pretty far behind. So now we're in 1971. China starts to move up. 1982, China's clearly taking off. All of a sudden, Kuwait is, boom, jumped all the way out in front, and now they're doing better than us. And so we get to 2013, and we can see that each country has taken a very different path towards developing, right? We can see that China was kind of stuck and stagnant for a very long time. It wasn't until about 1976 that they reached average life expectancy of 64. Whereas if we look at Kuwait, it took them all the way until about 1970. So this is kind of interesting because Kuwait clearly made some jumps in the income gap first, which did not necessarily relate to them becoming more healthy. They just made more money. Whereas China made significant improvements and changes in certain types of policies and family planning and healthcare, which allowed them to become healthy first before they became wealthy. And we kind of progressed at a very even pace where wealth increased, or life expectancy increased as wealth did. So this can be a little bit confusing because we have three different patterns of development, but at the end of the day, all of these countries have kind of ended up at the same point where life expectancies are relatively similar and income has clearly increased. And generally speaking, the world as a whole has experienced an increase in life expectancy and money that people make. But we can see that there are some very serious kind of clusters of countries that have lower life expectancy. So you can see through here, all these blue little dots are basically Africa and in India and some parts of Southeast Asia, which for some reason still have lower than expected life expectancy rates. And you could kind of speculate as to why. Maybe we know that there's HIV and AIDS epidemics in certain parts of Africa, but maybe that's not happening everywhere. And you can see that even the income gap and the life expectancy gap in Africa is very different. So what's really neat about this software is that you can look at differences that occur in the world as a whole, or you can really dive into specific regions and see if these patterns that we're experiencing or changes within how countries develop is happening in the place as a whole, or if there are very unique situations happening. So I encourage you to explore Gapminder and pick several different types of scenarios that may interest you to see how countries have developed over time, and maybe even explore some different variables. So if you look over here, instead of life expectancy, we could have, picked something like the number of children a woman has, or maybe the amount of energy one uses, or even maybe the amount of internet users. And so you can switch the variables on both of these axes to basically allow you to innovatively and creatively display and visualize demographic changes over time.